Hello. I see you all coming in. It's so exciting to see so many familiar names, some familiar faces, some new names, new faces for our program. This is our final program of our 2023 Juneteenth celebration, and I'm really excited about it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary Furlan-Minkoff. I am the Assistant Director of Archaeology and Curator of Archaeological Collections at James Madison's Montpelier. I am also a board member of the Orange County African American Historical Society, and I've had the honor of coordinating this year's Juneteenth celebration. For those of you who have been celebrating with us all month long, you know we've been celebrating in person and online in partnership between OCAHS, Montpelier, the Montpelier Descendants Committee, and the Art Center and Orange. And so we're really excited about this final program. We really have gone from June 1st, we're at June 29th, so one day shy of the whole month. But if you record this and you can watch it again tomorrow and celebrate all month long. I'm really excited for this program that I think really demonstrates a merging of these organizations together with our panelists and the conversations we're going to have today. If you haven't participated in some of the past programs, all of the recordings of the past virtual programs are posted up on the Orange County African American Historical Society's YouTube page, and you can get to that through our website, which is ocaahs.org. And you can look under the Juneteenth tab, and I'll put the link in the chat. I messaged you all in the waiting room because one of our panelists is literally en route moving across the country right now and has hit a bad weather spell. So we're hoping that she'll be able to get on and join us shortly. But I wanted to go ahead and get started with our welcomes and our introductions of our panelists. So here's hoping for some good weather on her. So our panel discussion tonight is titled Stories from Our Arts. This is going to be a discussion about the importance of arts for sharing ideas of freedom. And we've been talking about celebrating stories of freedom all month long. Our panelists tonight include Anna Pillow. Anna was born and raised in rural Virginia, and she currently serves as the executive director of the Art Center in Orange. She holds a master's in East Asian art from Sotheby's Institute in London and earned her BFA in painting from Old Dominion University. Anna believes that supporting artists is crucial for thriving, resilient communities. She's worked internationally with artist institutions and galleries, including the Japanese Living National Treasures, Takashi Murakami, and I'm going to butcher all of these, Ai Weiwei Sculptural Center, and Park Avenue Armory, the Chambers Fine Art, and Asia House UK, among others. She is also an artist who works in porcelain to create objects that celebrate beauty of everyday life. Our next panelist, Elle Renee. Elle Renee is a poet and nonfiction writer living in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where she works as the assistant director of the Furious Flower Poetry Center and assistant professor of English at James Madison University. Nominated for Best New Poets, Best of the Net, and 2 Pushcart Prizes, her work has been published in Obsidian, Tin House Online, Poetry Northwest, the Minnesota Review, and elsewhere. The granddaughter of proud Black Appalachians, she won the International 2022 Rattle Poetry Prize and Appalachian Review's Denny C. Plantner Award, among others. A recipient of fellowships from Cave Cunham Foundation and The Watering Hole, Elle Renee holds an MFA in creative writing from Indiana University, where she was the nonfiction editor of the Indiana Review, and an MS in journalism from Columbia University, where she was the Joseph Pulitzer II and Edith Moore Fellow. And our third panelist, who is en route, so hopefully will be able to join us here, is Larissa Rogers. Larissa Rogers is a Black and Korean visual artist raised in Ruckersville, Virginia. She is currently based between Virginia and Los Angeles, thus the cross-country road trip. She holds a BFA in painting from Virginia Commonwealth University and an MFA in new genres from UCLA. Rogers has exhibited and performed in institutions such as the Frise Seoul in Korea, Documenta 15 in Germany, the Fields Project in New York, M+B Gallery in California, 1708 Gallery in Virginia, 2nd Street Gallery in Virginia, Black Ground in Columbia, West Doha in Kedar, the Front Art Cultura in California, LACE in California, Grand Central Art Center in California, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Virginia, among others. She's received the Virtual Arts Fellowship at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in 2022, the Black Artists and Designers Guild Creative Futures Grant in 2022, and the Fine Arts Work Center Fellowship, currently 2023 through 2024. Larissa attended the BEMIS, B-E-M-I-S Center of Contemporary Art residency, the Black Spatial Relics residency, and the SOMA, among others. She's the co-founder of the Alternative Monument and Community Gathering Space, Operations Care, located in Charlottesville, Virginia, and will be installing a public sculpture with the Rose Kennedy Greenway in Boston in 2024. So we are really excited that Larissa has joined us and beat the weather. I see her beautiful face smiling at us, and it's perfect timing. And so I'm really excited about this program. And for those of you all who have joined us throughout the month, you know that we've been talking about this idea of Juneteenth and taking it beyond one day in June in 1865, and spreading out the idea and the stories of freedom through time and space. You know, Juneteenth happened in Texas, but the fight for freedom happened all over the country, and it certainly happened here in Virginia. Didn't wait just for African Americans, didn't wait until 1865 to be told they were free. They worked for their freedom for hundreds of years and continue to work for their freedom throughout time. And what's really, I think, exciting about this and this conversation of freedom is artistic expression in a huge variety of ways and ranges has always accompanied that. And our panelists really exemplify what art can mean. So we have visual art, performing art, poetry, all of these different types of ideas being expressed here. So I'm really excited to have this program tonight. I would also say for any of the audience members, we invite your questions and we welcome them. You are welcome to put them in the chat and I can ask them for you, but also at the end of the program, we'll have a designated time for questions. So if you want to raise your virtual hand, you can always do that towards the end of the program. But if you think of something, an idea, feel free to put it in the chat. So I want to go to our panelists now. Like I said, this is part of our Juneteenth celebration, which this year's theme was celebrating stories of freedom. So what do you think the role of the arts has been in facilitating freedom, and particularly for freedom for African Americans? El-Renee, I'm going to go to you first.
Hey y'all, I'm so delighted to be joining you. I am beaming in from Harrisonburg, Virginia at James Madison University and my office at Furious Flower Poetry Center. To answer your question, I also want to situate myself in the conversation a little bit. Furious Flower Poetry Center is the nation's first academic center dedicated to Black poetry. And so it is a delight that it is housed here in Virginia. So I want to make sure that if you all are not familiar with us, that you do know about the work that we're doing here, because I think that is in alignment, our mission, with kind of the question that you're posing. When we're thinking about the facilitation of freedom through the arts, particularly for Black artists, I think that we have to think about it not just in terms of our institutions, but also in terms of community, right? The ways in which, as my folks would say, Black people have made a whole lot of something out of a whole lot of nothing. I think that that's really important to think about the ways that through ethics of care, through on the ground work, that people have been able to make room for artists to create their work, but also create spaces for artists to display their work. And sometimes, and many times, that happens without the support of institutions and universities and so on. So I think relationships have been really important in creating space for Black artists. I come from a descendant of Black Appalachians from Tobacco Country, Virginia, and from coal mining West Virginia. And when I think about that lineage, I think about the ways in which storytelling has been particularly important in relating the stories of freedom. And for me, that's an aspect of Black arts that I want to bring into the conversation because it's often overlooked. The stories that Black people tell of the journeys that they've carried across time and how that gets passed along is a form of art. It's a way in which I think the written poetic tradition has grown out of. And so for me, I think that's a very important place in my own heritage of learning about spaces and places for the arts to be nourished in public school libraries, in griot circles, at fish fries with family members, right? So those spaces, those community spaces I want to emphasize have been really important. I think about quilters. I come also from a descendant of a lot of seamstresses, right? And the stories that are literally woven in the fabrics that get passed down, which is a kind of now often has been reduced to craft in certain ways. But that's an element of the Black arts space that I think is also important, that is inherited. So I want to offer those up. I have some other thoughts on that before I toss to Larissa, but I wanted to just make sure that when we're thinking about the arts, right, we're thinking broadly and expansively, that artistic spaces can happen on sidewalks in communities where people come together. Doo-wop, right, was not something that was on vinyl first, right? It had to start somewhere. And I think it's important that particularly in communities that the support of the arts is permeates beyond, as I said, just particularly institutions. I think that's part of our lineage as Black artists, is that, you know, there are the rent parties where people perform so they could afford their rent the next month, right? There are all of these dynamic spaces that I think Black folks have made possible for themselves. So I want to start there. Larissa, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you for that, Elena, and thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here despite the chaos. But I think I would agree. I think a lot about kind of again, these spaces that are traditionally haven't held support for Black folks, and how freedom is a lot about learning and unlearning, right? Like you said, making do with what you have, or imagination. Imagination being kind of like this space that is this, what I like to think about a lot is, like you were saying, kind of like these art forms that are held within us, that are passed down through generations, through body memory, through storytelling, cooking, through word of mouth. These things that are ephemeral in nature, but also are transient, are morphing, are mutating, that allow us to really be able to occupy a space that hasn't been made to support us or for us to thrive. And I think kind of learning and unlearning, like unlearning kind of like these systems, these spaces that we are made to believe that we're supposed to fit into, unlearning that, and then relearning kind of like how can we support one another, community, or even through me, kind of the way that I'm thinking and making objects or creating spaces with my work is a lot about kind of reimagining what something can be, despite the restrictions that are placed to create that. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there for now. I don't know if you wanted to hop in, Anna.
I will just to say that sometimes I think, especially when we're talking about art, you mentioned quilting as how it's been relegated to craft. We see this in any utilitarian object. And I think that a large part of the reason why we have this idea of these crafts not being legitimate art speaks to these systems of oppression and delegitimization that make it kind of seem like a futile effort. If we remove the ability for artists who in many ways are the visionaries, are looking towards the future, and I mean in every medium, whether it's music or poetry or performance, it doesn't matter. The artists of any culture are going to be the ones who are dreaming, who are trying to kind of scry into the future. It's a kind of magic. And I think that one of the things that gets done to art to kind of rob it of its power is to say, well, that's a craft, so it's not as important. And this is just one of the ways that this very patriarchal system is designed to say, this is legitimate, this is not. And that, I think, could very much position art, and does position art, as uniquely an expression of freedom. It's growing despite, and because of, honestly, that difficulty and that lack of legitimacy.
Wonderful, thank you. So Anna, I'm gonna go to you next with the next question. Particularly because you run an institution that exhibits art and educates people about art. So can you talk to us a little bit about how art has been used in the past and how it's being used today to sort of continue this fight for freedom?
Absolutely. And I mean, it kind of continues on. Just to say that, you have traditions that began out of necessity. I think some people may be familiar with face jars. We associate that with a lot of, coming out of Appalachia, but those were not, sometimes, depending on the kind of the story of that object that you hear, it's something that could be an expression that was the only opportunity for expression for some enslaved people. And so they were tasked with carrying water. They were given the materials to create a jug, and in that very confined opportunity, created art that was functional. And then, okay, then that's just a craft. But those faces that are on the jars are not random faces. They're not necessarily just ugly faces. They are, some of them are meant to be scary for, various ceremonial reasons, but some of them are depictions of spirits and gods that would have been important to the person who made them. And so I think that is something that, that's art that found a way despite horrible circumstances. That was a human being who was determined to express their freedom and their humanity, regardless of what kind of situation they were in. And then we can bring that forward into today, even as we think about ourselves as being, very egalitarian, and we have a society where anyone can thrive. Can we? And so I will just take a moment to share some images of contemporary works from artists who have kind of dealt with these themes and have incorporated freedom and being American and being incredibly American, patriotic in their work, because I think that this is a uniquely American United States First Amendment kind of value that you don't see necessarily in other places, and the context matters. So I'm just three. I'm not going to make this too long. But these are works that I think are very important for people to see. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of hard without having the visual to talk about visual art. And so the one that I have up here right now is Pray for America by David Hammons. And Hammons was born in 1943 and was known for his work with, well, it is still known for working with non-traditional materials that reference explicitly the African-American experience in an urban setting. And so he made this particular work 1 year after the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and RFK, and really looking at this moment that he was in 1969 as a Black man and trying to parse through what it meant to be an American and what that meant in a time that was so tumultuous. And I think that's something that we can probably relate to today, regardless of who we are. And then to follow that up with an artwork by Simone Leigh, who actually just represented the United States in the 2022 Venice Biennale, which is an international display of art by artists all over the world. It's very prestigious, but it also is an opportunity for nations to put forward the artist that represents them. So she represented us. And so this particular work, Brick House, obviously there's a message there, there's a reference there. And Simone Leigh often works and has publicly stated that her work is for and about Black women. And I think that even whether you're Black or white, if you encounter Simone Leigh's work, then it's either for you or it's something that you are better if you can appreciate it. So learning about her work, learning about the scholars that she's referencing, and learning about the ways of thinking that are presented in this visual way are something that sets her apart and has resonated. And that's why she is just definitely an artist to know, but an artist who is receiving all of her flowers as she should. And then I'll just leave that, the last image that I have is a work. It is a performance piece that was done by the artist Dred Scott. And of course that's not his legal name. He's taken his name from Dred Scott decision, right? And that Supreme Court case. This work is one where he literally had hundreds of reenactors come join him in New Orleans to reenact and retrace the path of the largest rebellion of enslaved people in the United States history that dated back to 1811. And as part of this, people were worried that the message wouldn't come across, that, you know, the idea of celebrating freedom as an idea was one that would be very threatening. And I can tell you that that didn't happen. It was a big learning moment for New Orleans, for, you know, the people who not only saw this, but the ones who participated in it. And then it was all documented by another Black artist, John Acompra, who is a wonderful filmmaker and deals and has done a lot of work looking at the history of Black Americans and telling those stories with literally through his lens. So I think that these are works that kind of span multiple genres and multiple media, but they're all speaking to the same thing. There are stories to be told that have not been told, and whether you are looking at a craft or a painting on a wall, you are still seeing human expression of freedom.
Absolutely, thank you. Renee or Larissa, would you like to expand on this?
Yeah, I just want to situate, to clarify one thing. When I'm using the language of craft, I think of all art as valuable and outlooks for expression as valuable. I think that people create because of these hierarchies of the way that folks ascribe value to different types of art. People can use the word craft, right, to denigrate or to devalue art that maybe perhaps is not seen in a gallery or is not hung up on a wall. And so I think when I'm talking about that language, I'm not trying to re-emphasize that we do that, right? I'm saying that that occurs. And so it's so important. I'm so grateful, Anna, that you brought up that point about actual artifacts, right? Art objects that were made, because that is as high art historically as some of these other things that we're talking about. And I think it's important to emphasize that in thinking about the visual art piece, a lot of poets use visual art to be in response to visual art pieces. And so in the world of poetry, we refer to that as ekphrastic poetry. That's poems that are engaging with visual art, sometimes music, sometimes dance, to continue the conversation. And that's something I'm really excited that so many Black artists or so many Black writers have taken upon to do, to be able to, in some ways, add nuance to our contemporary understanding of a particular artistic piece, especially when it's situated in myth, right? The way in which poets can play with our myths that the art may visually demonstrate to show a different kind of story of where those myths and visual artistic practices may come into play. I know for myself, teaching my students here at JMU, and also previously at Indiana University Bloomington, I use ekphrastic poetry as a way for students to really probe what they're looking at. I think when we're taking in visual information, particularly when it's 2D, sometimes that our perspective is already curated for us, right? But the thing that I love about poetry is that we can move the camera lens, right? So what happens when we're looking at a photograph and we see what's in the frame, but the poet inserts themselves to imagine, well, what's right to the left of the frame? Or who is taking the photograph to frame the visual narrative for us? What is the relationship between the photographer and the person being photographed? What does it mean to capture Blackness, right? And so I love the way, and of course I'm partial, but I love the way that poets can complicate and contradict and provide many different perspectives to some of this visual art, music, dance performances, right, that we see in the world around us. But our professional visual artist is here. So Larissa, I'm gonna toss it to you.
Yeah, I think just to kind of piggyback off of you, it reminds me of when Saidiya Hartman talks about critical fabulation and using that kind of critical fabulation and thinking about the archive, right, or the object and what is missing from that due to the gaps in the archive because of artifacts and knowledge is being destroyed. Like, how can we actually give these people, which are oftentimes Black, Indigenous, people of color, how can we give them life? How can we give them a totality of being, right? And a lot of times, or the way that Saidiya Hartman talks about it, it's about kind of using the imagination with the fact to then create this world or this story. And the way that you're talking about poetry being able to do that, I also think art has a really amazing ability to kind of seduce the viewer and then dismantle these kind of constructs or these ideologies of what or how we think about things. For me, like one thing that I really try to investigate with my work is using kind of these ephemeral materials or objects that have these connotations to them, and how do I complicate that? Or how can I use soil, which is something that's really important to me, to think about time and memory, for it to kind of be this material that holds this so much trauma, especially if we're talking about certain locations in which it's sourced from, right? And use that as a material to build objects or to talk about a people and to talk about resilience. But also it's also so kind of powerful because if you think about it, it also holds the actual like DNA of our ancestors, right? So we're actually, it's also this material that is literally connecting us, connecting these time periods, connecting these temporalities, and kind of giving us or proposing for me, like, how can we think about this, especially the material actually being like brown matter, right? Like, how can I bring that into a gallery space that's used to seeing these paintings or used to seeing things hung on a wall, and bring it into the space and propose, like, how can we interact with this? How can we acknowledge this? How can we care for this, right? And and use it similarly to any other material that we might see in a gallery space. And so I think when you were kind of talking about the way of switching narratives, switching perspectives, I think art has a really amazing ability to do that in all these different forms, and even through language, because a lot of times these expressions are so hard to articulate. They're so poetic, right? Like I even think about my practice, and when I'm making physical things, which often kind of disintegrate or have this aspect of time, I think about it poetically. And I think that allows for these nuances, because nothing is black and white. It's like it exists in such a gray area. And I think kind of the ability to use these materials and to use imagination to fill in the gaps of the archives, especially of Black people and their lives and their histories, is a way that we can propose kind of new possibilities or futurities for like how we're moving.
I think it's really amazing. And what I think is really beautiful about what you all have said is how it's important to have all of these multiple perspectives and all of these different approaches, whether it's visual arts, poetry, performing arts, music, all of this coming together to create this whole picture and these multitudes of understanding. And as someone who works studying the past, that's one of the things we try to do. And Larissa, you referenced the archive, and one of the sort of things that I found so inspiring was when we were doing our kind of rehearsal talk, how much we were talking about the use of the archive and what that means. So as a museum professional, we think of using archaeological artifacts and documents and oral histories, all of that to tell stories of the past, but you all are using that as part of your art as well, which I think is just absolutely amazing and adds this new dimension. So Alarne, I know you had a poem that you wanted to share with us that connects with this idea of being inspired by the archive.
Yeah, bless. I'm so excited to learn of Larissa's work. Check the chat. The link is in the chat for her work. Also, my work is at elrenepoems.com. And my work also, I think we're in alignment. I do a lot of work around taking the oral history recordings of my elders, who are all in their 80s now, who track my family's migration from, as I said, tobacco country, Virginia, to coal mine in West Virginia, to Ohio, where I was born. And then for me, my return to Virginia for school and subsequently this kind of loop that I see that I'm circling around. And so I use oral histories, I use genealogical documents, I travel to libraries, I go to different communities to situate myself in the places where my ancestors have lived and labored. And one of the things that I'm always kind of wrestling with is that tension, to Larissa's point, between, right, what is documented in the archive, the Capitol Archive, that is seen often through the lens of the state, right, often through the lens of the patriarchal value system, versus these kind of ephemeral archives, as you were talking about, oral histories. For me, I'm the keeper of my family's stuff. So I have my granddaddy's coal mining card from the 1930s. I have my grandmother's hair pressing comb that's been passed down for generations. I have a family Bible that we don't quite know how old it is, that still has braids and locks of hair that my family would keep. Right. And so I have these material objects, and I have these oral histories, and I have these documents, and I'm triangulating between these things constantly to make poems. So I'm going to read a poem today that is based and situated. Now, we do know, I should put a little asterisk, we know poetry is fiction, right? A lot of people, as soon as they hear a poem, they're like, oh, I can't believe that happened. And I was like, it happened to the speaker, right? The speaker is not always me, the author, right? But this particular poem is based on a research trip that I took. I have an ancestor in my family who everyone said that her eldest daughter, who my eldest aunts and uncles all knew, everyone said that they felt more like sisters than mother and daughter. And there was this question around that. And this poem kind of leans toward that question. I also should say in this poem, I'm thinking a lot about the ways in which Black people, people in color in general, have persisted through trauma, but the way some of these cycles of trauma are also carried on and passed down, and unfortunately in some situations repeated. So I will give a little trigger warning. This has to do with survivorship. The poem is entitled Genealogical Trip to Pulaski, Virginia. The mayfly swarm undulates like the perfect hip roll, mottled bodies plow brown bodies midair. Wings fade as fine gossamer in June sun, buoyed by a buzz too quick to be caught by my eye, which doesn't want to bear the witnessing. How nature persists in getting on with it publicly. Life, sex, death in the span of a day. I turn away, overcome by shame. I look through my Ford's cracked glass at white mile markers blurring a Black highway. Why does our making always begin in denial? When I find my great-great-grandmother, Frances Hounshell, in census records, branded mulatto and a mother at age 9, I do not wince. I practice numbness, focus only on getting back to the alpha mama who owned her own body, her own name, somewhere off the coast of Ghana or Nigeria, maybe, where her breath, not her sweat, was enough currency. In Virginia, it's common to see the dead. Mayflies skip across pavement like flat rocks tossed side-armed at a stream's surface, then lodged in sidewalk cracks among orphan pebbles, sticks, and sprigs of grass. I'd rather look at uncountable rows of tobacco leaves, which leave me breathless, dizzy even. All those green ears flap like an elephant's hello, hang woody scents heavy through my car vents like next of kin hugs, hugged only at family reunions. In death, female mayfly lips freeze into an O, as if readying a whistle, as if leaving evidence of no. After the males give chase, grab their tiny legs, drag them to the ground. After the mount, it happens like this. Whole lives purposed for labor and procreation. Night collects her bounty. By daybreak, bodies pile by the hundreds on windowsills and porch corners, in the middle of a passage pedestrian stroll between a jail and a courthouse. The nice white genealogist at the local library tells me Frances's age must be wrong, an error in reporting. But I know a nymph can be snatched from her skin, molt and molt until she becomes something new, gains wings, if only for a brief view of the dust she will soon call home. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really beautiful. I'm really thankful that you were able to share one of your poems with us, and it was so beautiful and visceral, and I could just say wonderful things. But that won't help the conversation. So I want to continue this sort of talk about the inspiration from the archive and this work that you all are doing. So I don't know, Renee, if you want to expand a little bit, or if Larissa, you want to talk a little bit about your work. But I'm just having some feelings right now. So thank you for that poetry.
Yeah, I'll flip it to Larissa. I should have said earlier to situate it what the mayfly was, not knowing that everybody knows what mayflies were. But I was trying to think of a metaphor, right? What could hold a kind of innocence being plucked from someone without a choice? Like, what does that look like to have such a short period of time in whatever relative childhood one could have, right? As an enslaved person. And I, like, when I realized I was on my way to this place and I got caught up in another place and there were all these mayflies everywhere. It was like all of these dead witnesses of a truncated life. And that image struck me so deeply when I was trying to search for a metaphor to hold what that meant. Returning back to the land, which Larissa has mentioned is really important in her work as well. And I'm like, that's the thing that I'm trying to get to. And that inability of this researcher to think it possible that my ancestor could have potentially had a child at 9, that refusal to acknowledge the conditions that might have made that possible was infuriating to me. And I needed a place to put that. I needed a place to put the history, what the research said, what my family said, what other documents that corroborated parts of what my family said that the census didn't. I needed a place to put all of that. And for me, that's always a poem. So I should have situated it in that way before, that our landscapes, the natural world, for me, is a place sometimes I go to when this 3D world and the spiritual realm, but when this 3D world like doesn't feel quite right at offering what I'm trying to reach toward. So I love, Larissa, your mentioning of that soil and thinking about the way in which materiality has the capacity, right, to hold so much. So I'd love to hear more about what you're doing with that.
Yeah, thank you, Renee, and thank you for that beautiful poem. I also felt it so viscerally. And I think one thing that really stood out while listening to you speak was thinking about inheritance, thinking about memory and amnesia. And I think one of the essential questions that I'm always thinking about, right, is this refusal to forget is really important when we're talking about these histories that are very much still present, right? Because the past is simultaneously the present and is always impacting what is coming and what is happening. And so kind of thinking about like, what does surviving mean? What it does it mean to be surviving? And kind of how do we hold these stories, these traumas, these histories, even in our family, or in our genealogy that we don't have physical record of, right? And a lot of times, like, that's held within the body. And I think a lot about kind of like blood memory. And very much a lot of times when I'm working in the studio or in my practice, because sometimes the studio is simply just me and my thoughts. I'm in my thoughts a lot. But kind of, yeah, like these instincts that I get to do certain things. And I'm like, where, like, I don't know. I can't explain them. Like, I don't know why I'm called to do this. But it's this kind of way that I feel like I have a connection and that I'm talking to my ancestors, or to thinking about how all of these materials in which I'm working with, even through landscape, how we're always constantly impacted by them, and how they're always kind of telling and directing our bodies and our thoughts and our minds. And so I think a lot of times kind of and especially the way that I'm thinking through land and thinking through soil and place, and also being someone who was born and raised in Virginia, who spent most of my time in Virginia, particularly in Charlottesville, at the surrounding areas, went to undergrad in Richmond, and then I went to the West Coast, just completed my graduate studies. But I think one of the things that impacted me the most when I moved to the West Coast was the landscape, and just thinking about how much different it is, and how I was always impacted through these spaces that I hadn't really spent that time with, how my body felt, just physically felt different. And I think it's really important to refuse to forget. And Bell Hooks has this beautiful quote where she's kind of speaking about home, and talking about how for Black folks, home is not a place, right? It's not a physical. We are displaced people. We have been removed from our homelands, from our families. Yeah, like diasporic distance is real. But when we think about home, it's kind of like home is this refusal to I don't want to butcher her quote because Bell Hooks is so eloquent. But the end of the line, it says, our struggle is also a struggle of memory against forgetting. And I think that just ties straight back to all the work that you're doing, and that I'm aiming to do with my practice. Is it's really indexing and trying to put down or create something that is so intangible, but is also a refusal to continue to allow these stories to not be told and seen and heard, and actually kind of give a space, be a conduit for these stories to emerge, right? And so I'm not sure where I started, but yeah, I'm just kind of like thinking a lot, right, about healing, too. Kind of what does healing look like, and how can we also talk about healing outside of this capitalist ideal of how we are marketed what healing looks like. And for me right now, I'm thinking a lot about scars. I'm thinking about scarification, about keloids, like the physical body, how the body holds it, right? When you heal, there's still a mark. Like when I fell down when I was 3, I still have that mark on my knee. So that reminds me of that pain, but it's still there. And through that scar, through that keloiding of the body, I'm then made to remember, right? And so how can our practice, how can art kind of be that keloid, be that conduit for healing, but it simultaneously holds and reminds us of that pain, of that triumph, and do both. Be kind of this, I'm thinking a lot about like monstrous beauty right now. I'm like, what does that mean? How can we hold that? And how can we create that? Especially in art, because people just want things to be pretty, pretty, pretty. And like sometimes we need ugly to acknowledge and see and really cherish that beauty, right? But then that's also a whole nother conversation about the politics of beauty and where those ideals are coming from, especially. But yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
And I will just but in just to say, as you say that, Larissa, and one of the things that really drew me to your work when I saw Larissa's work before I knew her. And one of the things that really drew me to your work was that you are representing the sublime. And that is a word that we don't often use correctly. It's like, oh man, this is sublime about a dessert. I hope not. I sincerely hope that your dessert is not sublime, because if it is sublime, then that means that it is as beautiful as it is terrifying. And I'm really not sure what you're eating. So, but I think that that is something that your work is grappling with. And that there is that ability to see something that is elegant, that you make elegant work that can be seen on its face. And again, I say elegant, not necessarily beautiful or pretty, right? You have made pretty things, but that is not a requirement for your practice, and that is clear. And so I think that people have become in comfort, right, in not being challenged, have self-selected a world where, art is a painting of flowers on a wall. It certainly can be, but that's not the only thing. And sublime stands out to us even when you're talking about kind of the layman's version of that, and you're not immersed in the arts. It still draws people because they're still using this word even incorrectly. And I think that goes back to poetry and how it can kind of, these words, they creep in there and then in your consciousness, and then they make you see things from a different perspective, whether you thought you were going to do that or not.
What I think is really amazing about what you all are talking about is how this messiness, this complicatedness, this desire to not just see things as pretty or simple or superficial is the exact same conversations we're having in the world of history, museums, and understanding the past, archaeology. It's these same conversations of, in the same way that there's a limited view of maybe art can only be pretty flowers on the wall, there's a view that history can only be a pretty whitewashed, nostalgic version of the past. And I think in particular, because you all draw so much off the past, I think it's just such a beautiful, like parallel tracks of understanding and viewing both the past and the present. But I did want to say with that, we're living in a time right now and in a state where both are how we understand the past and art are under attack, whether it's book bannings, whether it is regulating what can be taught in a classroom, or all of these things. So how do you think we as a community should be responding to these attacks on our art, our expression, and how that connects to our understanding of who we are and who we've been? So Anna, do you want to go first? I know you've dealt with some of this firsthand, and then we can go.
And I think that this was something that I read in an interview of a poet, actually, Adrienne Rich, and she was being interviewed by I think it was New York Times. It was in the 90s. It was a long time ago. But she sorry to remind everybody it was a long time ago. But so she was in this interview and she was being interviewed about her poetry. And for anybody who doesn't know about Adrienne Rich, she was a Jewish female poet who at one point basically she had a very rich life, and she kind of at one point even banned men from even entering the room she was reading her poetry in. She was like, get out of here, you're not welcome, bye. And she was very brusque about it, and she never apologized. She eventually let the men back in, but in this particular interview, she had, I think there'd been a controversy of some kind around poetry, maybe. And she was asked, when people come up to you and they're angry about poetry and, oh, it's not for me, I don't like poetry, whatever, right? Very flippant. And her response to that was, I see that as a reaction, and I'm heavily paraphrasing, just to say, I see that as a reaction of someone who has had something taken from them and they do not even know that it was stolen. And so that thing that she was talking about, of course, was poetry as something that belongs to everyone. Anyone could be a poet. They could make poetry, right? Just like anybody could make art. And when we have these barriers up that tell us in our society that only this kind of person can do that, or only this kind of, expression is valid, that's the stealing. That's the thievery right there, that these things have been taken away from everyday people who need to express their humanity on a very basic level every day. And that has been stolen from us. And so I think that when you speak also about freedom and you're looking at marginalized communities and groups, then that becomes even more relevant and even more important when you're looking at those forms of expression.
Excellent, thank you. Oh, Renee, how do you think we as a community should be responding to all of this?
Okay, I'm going to offer two things. I'm going to piggyback a little bit on Anna. I love that you brought a poet in the room. I also want to bring the words of a Black feminist poet, Audre Lorde, in the room, who penned a famous essay, "Poetry is Not a Luxury." Audre Lorde wrote, "Poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we can predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. Poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. The farthest external horizons of our hopes and fears are cobbled by our poems, carved from the rock of experience of our daily lives. And I love that, because I think that in the same way that people think about poetry as a luxury, it's the way that people also insert any kind of version of artistic expression. I love that you brought in that word sublime, that it feels like, oh, look, that's that flitty, funny thing these people who are daydreamers make, right? It is vital. It is vital to the way in which we orient ourselves, to the truths that we tell. A wonderful poet who I'm in great debt to for her work, Nikki Finney, says poetry is the heart's journalism, right? I talk to students about there's a difference between fact and the truth, right? We have fact in some of these historical documents that we've referenced, but we also have truth that is often missing from those documents. And so our poets, our griots, our storytellers, our makers, for me, offer a kind of vessel of the truth. They are oriented, I put myself in that category as an artist, we are oriented to look at the world and not look away. And sometimes in that looking, it's hard, it's difficult. Sometimes in that looking, we implicate ourselves. We implicate our families. We implicate what has been passed down to us that was meant for someone else's survival at the expense of another, right? There are that word Larissa used, unlearning. There are things we have to unlearn. And art provides that platform for us to reach toward that. And so when we see these groups that are particularly targeting the artists of our world, that is not a coincidence. That is not a coincidence. When we target a place of freedom, of expression, of probing, of complicating, right? What we are then doing, for me in my mind, is saying that there is one way to interpret history, to interpret fact, to interpret identity. And that way has to be in alignment with those in power. If it's not, then it threatens their way of moving in the world. And so there's an agenda attached to this. So we have to work vigorously in our communities, with our institutions, with our friends, to really keep the arts alive, to keep arts education programming alive, so our children can wonder, can explore, can be the recipient of ways of challenging or expressing themselves. I think that is so critical and that it's so important. that we do that work. And I think the second point, the second person I'd love to bring into the world, who is a very strong political poet, a poet who was controversial in her time and maybe still today, June Jordan. She has a poem called Poem About My Rights. That's a political poem, but certainly the rallying call at the end of the poem, which I think is also really important when we're thinking about multiple narratives, there being not just one way of interpretation. She says at the end of this poem, I am not wrong. Wrong is not my name. My name is my own, my own, my own, my own, my own, right? And I think that's something that echoes in my mind all the time. I'm not wrong. My experience as a Black woman in the world is not wrong. It's my experience, right? The same can be true for many other people across many other identities. So we have to be really mindful of, there's not this right versus wrong, right? There's a multiplicity of identities, of experiences, and they're all valid and they're all important. And the arts for me hold space for those multiple truths that can contradict each other, right? That are not settled and neat, but are critical, because we all bring everything that we were taught, everything that we inherited with us in this current human, American, situated in Virginia, Virginian experiment. We need all of each other. We need everyone. We need everyone. And the arts is a way that we can bring that together. And that's the way that we breathe. That's the way that we orient ourselves. And yeah, I could go on and on about that, but it's so critical and it's so important. And the fact that it's under attack right now is not a coincidence.
Same question to you, Larissa.
Yeah, I'm going to be brief because that was so beautiful and I don't know how to it's kind of add, because you've articulated so beautifully, El Renee, but it made me think a lot about, like you were saying, this importance of multiplicity and how kind of this attack on the arts is really an attack against power and really an attack against a single narrative, right? Which is there to kind of constrain us into one way of being and seeing, when that is just inherently not how we exist and how we interact with one another and how we are here. And it made me think a lot about kind of this sense of multiplicity. Fred Moten talks a lot about Black fugitivity, and Black fugitivity essentially being a spirit of escape, which is a freedom drive, and a death drive, which I think, just to end this conversation, I feel like just sums it up so kind of poignantly about being able to occupy. This idea of kind of Black fugitivity is one of being able to occupy multiple spaces, and spaces that we were never meant to be in the first place, right? And how that allows and creates this freedom, but it also creates a sense of being threatened or threatening a system of power, and that inherently kind of being a death sentence. But I think that at the core, we have to protect and continue to refuse to be restricted into or be narrow-minded, or we have to refuse to forget. We have to be able to occupy and stand true and kind of in ourselves and our multiplicities, and challenge these the ways in which we are kind of constructed to move and be and think. And I think that's what the beauty of art is, and that's why it's so powerful. And it's I think, like you were saying, it's not a luxury at all. It's really a it's a way of being. It's like we, since we have been making. It's how we communicate. It's how we're able to bridge gaps, and that's how we can start to think about what does it mean to support one another? Like, how can we think about solidarity across peoples, across places, and acknowledge our differences and use that as a way to create a future, create a place in which we all want to inhabit. I think art has the ability to do that, and that's why it's threatening, but that's also why we have to continue to make and do and remember and embody.
Amazing, thank you. I know we're a little over time, but we do have one question in the chat. I'll throw it out to the whole panel and see if anybody has a response. But Christine asks about if any of the panel members had thoughts on music and musical instruments and their ancestry and culture, and just sort of this conversation. That's a connection to a big topic, but did anybody want to give sort of a quick response there?
Well, I could just jump in quickly to say that, it's interesting that it's about a banjo that the question is being asked, because across cultures, I mean, you read out all those Japanese names, right? And so I'll just kind of draw a quick parallel there. During World War II, Okinawa, Japan, they had kind of a distinct culture from the rest of the country. They're very isolated historically. And one of the things that they have in Okinawa is an instrument called a sanshin, which is like 3 strings. And this is like just a very simple banjo. And it's inspired by a traditional Chinese instrument. They've got a similar one there, which is just to say, all the way across the planet, right? You have people who are making the same kind of instrument to make the same kind of music. And when I get over to Okinawa and I learn about this instrument, I'm like, how is this any different from the people who pick up and make and they make a banjo? And so in World War II, when the Okinawan people did not have, they had, so many shortages, they weren't able to get things, they weren't able to make these beautiful instruments. And so what they would do is they would still make them. They would make them with tin cans. And so today there are still people who make them, and there are ones that have been kept that are made out of tin cans and sticks and whatever strings they could get. And maybe they had snakeskin on them, but probably not. But even still, they would decorate their tin can sanshin. And so I think that this idea of once you start making art, once you are expressing your humanity in one way or another, then you're going to kind of spread out and you're going to keep doing that and you're going to double down on it, honestly. And it doesn't matter what you're making. And when you have something that's music that you do not need to know the words that they are singing to know that it is music or even what it's saying or what it's about, then it's just natural. And what if we made art about this in other ways too? And it all kind of, once you start getting that ball rolling, you're going to keep seeing expression, you're going to keep seeing it branch out.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I am a poet who's led by music. Poetry for me first began with music and sound. And so I think about, I guess maybe connecting to the banjo, I think about my ancestors who, in cold country on the porch with how we call it a guitar, and the homebrew beer in the bathtub, we're making songs and things like that. That definitely influenced me. I think about the songs that people made, how people incorporated labor into music. Every time, I don't know why, when I go down through West Virginia, I'm always thinking of 16 tons. In that song, I think about, for me, in the way my family is situated, gospel is huge. The way in which people use hymns as a way of thinking about, back to the beginning question we had about freedom, thinking about, let my people go, right? That came from a place where Black folks created spirituals out of which, you know, R&B and rock and all of these things kind of bloomed from there. So music is definitely a huge influence on my work, but I think it's also a huge influence on a lot of poets' work across, you know, the diaspora and also across other identities. Music was a way in which I studied Irish contemporary poets, right? To think about the way people in Ireland in the pubs would tell stories through song, right? So all of these, it's a connector, and the same way visual arts is a connector and poetry is a connector, music is a connector, dance is a connector. It goes back to Larissa's point that art is a place where people across cultures, backgrounds, geographies, and histories can meet and find meaning. And hopefully at the end of it, that's the goal at the end of it, right? As an artist, that people leave transformed, that they leave witnessing a thing, experiencing a thing, not the way that they came. That is the goal, that it moves you and connects you to other people.
Absolutely. All right, my final question for you all tonight. What is one word you want to leave everyone with this evening? And that this is the challenge. And I would say every time I've asked people this question, they're like, well, I've got 3 or I've got 2. So if you go over, you'll still get an A for the assignment. But one word you want folks to leave with, Larissa.
Like, no, don't call me first. Okay, one word. Persistence.
That's a great one. Anna, one word.
I mean, I have no choice but to go with sublime.
Perfect. Renee, one word.
Bounty.
I love it. Well, mine is going to be gratitude, because I am so thankful for you all spending this time with us, sharing your knowledge, your stories, your amazing art with us. We have people joining us in this program. Our audience members have been from across the country, a lot from right here in Virginia, and a lot of people in particular that are part of, and in Liberia. We've got people joining from Liberia. So across the world, and particularly people that are part of the descendant community of those that are descendants of those who are enslaved right here in Virginia. And so much of what you all talked about, I think, is so incredibly meaningful as we try to understand our past, our present, and how those things interact. So I just want to thank you all so much for your time tonight, for your knowledge, for your creations, for your community work, your education. And I also want to thank all of the folks that have joined us for these conversations throughout the month, those who joined us tonight, those who've joined us all month long. If you've missed any of the presentations, they are online. I put the link in the chat. Please watch them. This has been recorded, so it is going to go up online as well, so you can share it with your friends if they missed it. And just as a personal note, this is tomorrow is my last day working for Montpelier. And soon I will be leaving Virginia, not forever, but for a while. And this was just such a wonderful way to kind of close out that experience. So thank you. I'm so honored to have been able to be in this virtual room with you all tonight. So, have a good night, everyone.